Well, I just recently did a video on this knife, the Case Whaler, and in that video I mentioned that it was a rope knife, and I think I did a fairly decent job explaining the history of Case and the Whaler, when the pattern came out and everything, but I really didn't discuss a whole lot about the history of rope knives in general, and rather than try and go back and reshoot that whole video and get that information in there, I thought what I would do instead is kind of do a part two here and talk a little bit about rope knives in general and the history of a rope knife. And well, the obviously the knife is not made of rope; it is a knife made to cut rope. And obviously just about any knife can cut rope. So why is it called a rope knife? And that's really because these are knives that were designed for use aboard sailing ships back a long time ago, and they were used to take care of the ropes, specifically when it came to cutting a line quickly. And there was a lot of design going into it. So other names for these knives are like rigging knives and things of that nature. Normally when a person hears the term rigging knife, they think of a knife such as this, one with a marlin spike on it. These are also called marlin spike knives. But it is just another type of nautical knife. And yeah, it's a rigger. But this is kind of the combination of the marlin spike and the rope knife. As you can tell here, it has a sheepfoot blade. This particular one is by Camillus. Several companies have made rigging knives or marlin spike knives. But typically when the marlin spike is missing on the knife, it is referred to as a rope knife, especially if it is a folder. If it's a folding knife designed for cutting rope on board a ship, it's called a rope knife. Now, rope knives are not always folding knives. Matter of fact, the original rope knives were not folding knives. And basically, there have been rope knives around basically as long as ships have gone to sea to sail. Rope knives are still used today, even on ships that do not sail or boats that don't sail. But typically, the rope knife is associated with sailing craft, with the tall ships and things of that nature. Now, in the back here is a Meyer rope knife, and as you can tell, at the very front of the sheath here, you have the marlin spike because, well, it's basically the whole system that you're looking at. So it's a separate marlin spike that also goes into the sheath. Notice the marlin spike also has a shackle key in it there. This is a modern style of rope knife. There's several other types of rope knives out there too. But let's get the knife out. And as you can tell, this rope knife also has a sheepfoot blade. The sheepfoot blade has been used on rope knives forever. There's a lot of myth around how the sheepfoot blade was developed for maritime use. A lot of it comes down to almost to the point of urban legend about basically the sea captains breaking the tips off of blades because they were worried about their crew mutinying and going around stabbing each other with it and everything. More likely, there is definitely stories of, actually documented stories of ships' captains doing that, where they would break the tip off of a knife. But typically, when that was happening, it had nothing to do with the shape of the blade, that the fact that the blade was pointy. It was that the knife was longer than allowed by regulation. There were actually maritime regulations stating how large the knife could be, and if a sailor tried to bring in a knife that was longer than allowed, they would actually place it on a basically right there at the boarding spot, right on the rail. They had it measured out how long the knife could be, and if it was longer than that, they would mark it, and then the blade would get cut or broken to be the right length. And it didn't matter if the blade was rounded or not. So that might be where the myth came from, them breaking the blades of pointy blades. But as far as I've been able to find, there has never been a regulation put out in any Navy or in any maritime service that specifically forbade a pointy blade. They always marked how large the blade could be. And what basically happened is sometime in the 19th century, so somewhere in the early to mid 1800s, a lot of maritime services started saying no more fixed blades. And when they did that, then you saw a growth in the use of folding rope knives, also with folding or with a sheepfoot blade. But you'd be surprised that even in the 1800s and in the 1900s, there were still rope knives that had a point, because sometimes some sailors preferred a pointy blade versus a straight blade going across the bottom here, because they might have needed it for other uses and such. And obviously there's other pointy knives on board ships, but the rope knife typically was with a sheepfoot or just a blunted end of the blade with a sharp, a relatively straight edge going on there. And the reason that was done that way is so that you would have maximum length, straight edge, no point, so you didn't have to worry about cutting yourself or poking yourself by accident when you'd be up in the rigging and stuff. And the idea is you could place that knife down on the rope and then baton through the rope using a belaying pin or a wooden mallet. So you would be hitting the back of your knife with a wooden belaying pin or a wooden mallet to cut through the rope. And that was usually done in times of an emergency and such. Obviously, if you needed to cut into a sail or something, you still have a point here so that you could actually cut down and pull the knife across and cut. So the design of the rope knife really was meant for cutting rope and for doing other chores on board a ship. And the fact that, well, ships have a tendency to move and rock and roll, and especially if you're up in the rigging and stuff, things kind of move around a little bit. The last thing you really want is a point on the end of your blade. It's bad enough that you got a sharp edge. So that's why the shape of the sheepfoot blade was around for a rope knife. And when they went over to going into the folding knives, that's also why you still see a sheepfoot blade on them. But like I said, you will also find some old rope knives that have a spear point on them also. If you remember, there's a lot of people have pointed out that the elephant toenails and such as this knife here, is also a knife used for cutting rope and stuff. And as you can tell, this has a spear point, but is a short, stiff blade, again with a spine that you could actually get onto the rope and baton against the back of it. So you have a heavy blade designed for batoning with a wooden mallet, even when you're dealing with a folding knife. And when you're batoning with a folding knife, what you end up doing is you're going to be holding the knife by the edge of the blade, and you're going to strike it here. So you're striking pretty close to your fingers, but the idea is you're not getting out there like that and hitting it, because then you can break the pivot point. So you're actually holding it here, and all the striking is going against the blade. nothing is really affecting the handle. So even the folding knives were made for batoning, and that's why they are as long as they are. I mentioned this one before too. This is a Camillus rope knife. This is the S702. They have it with, and the earlier ones did not have a can opener. The can opener was added. The big story about these is they were marked as Coast Guard approved, and people think of them as a Coast Guard knife, but they were really approved by the Coast Guard for use in maritime service. So for the merchant marines and stuff, right after, well, during World War II and right after World War II. But in any case, I don't want to dwell on this a real long time or anything, but I did think it was an interesting topic to go over what a rope knife is, how it developed, and so on and so forth. Really, the popularity of the folding rope knife really took off in the middle of the 1800s when basically a lot of navies and also merchant marine services started forbidding the use of a fixed blade on board the ship. So the folders became a lot more popular. Today, you will still find some services that some merchant marines who will be using a fixed blade rope knife. I mean, the one here, the Meyer rope knives, are actually approved for use with the U.S. Coast Guard. So that's one of them. But at the same time, Meyer also makes folding rigging knives that are also approved for the U.S. Coast Guard. Groman also makes a really interesting rope knife, and theirs actually does have a point. So there you go. Not all rope knives are a sheepfoot blade, but that is the most common that you see, especially these days among the folding rope knives. I should also mention a little bit about the history of the name rope knife, because obviously these knives have not always been known as a rope knife, and they're going to be called different things in other languages other than English. I think rope knife actually is a very recent term, and it was a term developed by manufacturers probably sometime in the late 19th century to help sell the knives. Originally, well, let's go back to the 1600s. These types of knives, this would have been known as a gully in the English language, and all that really means is a large knife. But that's what they would have been known as on board a ship, as a gully. And the smaller knives, the folders, they were known as a folding gully, and that's the way that they would just be known as. And like I said, there was nothing specific about it because they were made in small factories and stuff. They were not mass produced or anything like they are today, and every one of them would be slightly different, and it would be just known as a folding gully. And it basically meant large knife. It was from the Scottish. It's an old Celtic term, basically, that meant large knife. By the time we reached the 1700s, sailors were known as jack tar, and basically jack was a term used for day labor, whether it be a skilled laborer or just an unskilled laborer. If they worked in the trades, they were often known as a jack, and that's the term used for the person. And tar referred to the type of clothing that was worn by sailors. It was short for tarpaulin, and what a tarpaulin was, it referred to the waterproofed canvas coats that sailors were known to wear, especially when they arrived in port. They had these coats and hats that were made out of sailing canvas that had been coated with tar to make them waterproof, and so the sailors were known as Jack Tar. It was not necessarily a derogatory term either, because they referred to each other as Jack Tar. And by this time, sailors had a semi-distinctive folding knife that they carried with them. So a sailor's jackknife was known as a sailor's jack, because, well, they were a jack, and the knife that came off of them was started being known as a jackknife, because it was a knife that tradesmen would be using. It was a large work knife, basically, and so these would have been known as a sailor's jack. And then eventually that term would remain in use, at least in the United States. In England, the term would turn into clasp knife, which is basically a large folding knife, was known as a clasp knife. You still heard that term also here in the United States, but usually not as often. Usually, and a jackknife these days in America just means a knife that has all the blades opening from one side. So any kind of single-bladed knife could be known as a jackknife. And so that's where the term really starts coming into play. Here in America, this would have been known as a jackknife, and you still see in the U.S. Navy knives known as a jack. But in British service, they're often known as a clasp knife. But obviously, it's kind of hard to define a knife or distinguish one knife from another if all of them are jackknives and all of them are clasp knives. So manufacturers, or possibly even the users, develop names for the various knives. And so, because this is a specific type of jackknife that is used for cutting rope, why would you not call it a rope knife? I mean, by the 1800s, you have all sorts of names coming out for different knives. You have the stock knives, or stockmans. You have the powder horns. You have folding hunters, and so on and so forth. So, you've got to give a name to a knife, and so these ended up being known as a rope knife because, well, they cut rope, and this became known as a rigging knife because, well, you've got all the tools you need for rigging lines and stuff, and so that's kind of how it goes about developing names and everything. So I would say that these types of knives were known as rope knives probably starting shortly after the American Civil War, and that's also when they started getting the folding jackknives like this started actually entering into U.S. Navy service almost on an official basis. Before then, the knives that were brought into service were the knives that the sailors themselves had bought, but by the time the Civil War came about, the U.S. Navy finally started actually purchasing knives for use aboard ship, and they were known as a jackknife as far back as then, and they would be given a number, but they would also be given a name or so. So that's why this is basically the sailor's jack, or your rope knife. Anyway, if I continue to ramble, I won't be able to really add anything more to it other than more rambling, so I will leave it at that.